Victorian Railways sleeping cars. This article is intended as a catalogue of sleeping carriages used by the Victorian Railways and successors. O-type carriages. Man cars 1-40, 29-030. In 1886, delivery was taken of 4 sleeping carriages built by the Man Boudoir Car Company of New York. The first two, 10 and 20, were delivered on 22 October 1886, and 30 and 40 entered service on 24 December of the same year. The cars had 20 berths attached to a corridor with exposed and platform diaphragms. Additional cars 29 and 30 entered service on 30 October 1889, identical to their predecessors. It is possible that 29 was constructed at Newport workshops, having been delivered as a kit of parts. In 1907, the E-type carriage sleepers were entering service, and these sleepers were rendered obsolete, so the O fleet was split roughly equally between the two railways. In March 1908, the Man Boudoir cars were reallocated. 10 and 40 went to the South Australian Railways. The pair were issued numbered 116 and 117 in the SAR fleet, while 20 and 30 became sleeper No. 6 and Mildura in the Victorian Railways fleet. 29 and 30 were retained in joint stock service until further E-type sleeping cars had been delivered, but they were allocated names Latrobe and Hindmarsh respectively. South Australian Railways. Cars 116 and 117 entered SAR exclusive service in 1908. 116 was fitted with electric lighting, and one end was altered to an observation car profile for departmental inspection tours in 1909. It was renamed Wallacra in 1910 and retained in that service until 1933, when it was officially condemned, though reports exist of it having been part of the 1934 Royal Tour pilot train. The car was sold to Roth & Co. in 1935. 117 was named Broughton in 1911 and altered like Wallacra as an observation car in 1913, presumably including fitting of electric lighting. In April 1930, it was converted to State Viceregal Car No. 1, and it was retained in that capacity until 1940, when it was withdrawn and sold to W. Brown & Sons Limited. It ended its days as a house boat at Goolwa. Eventually it fell into disrepair and was broken up about 1974. Hindmarsh was allocated to the SAR in 1920, and it is known that it was used on that railway's Renmark Express service during 1927-1929. The car was recorded as scrapped in 1933, but it had been used as part of the 1934 Royal Tour Duke of Gloucester's pilot train between Tarley and Adelaide. Carriage number 118 had long since been allocated to a different vehicle, so the car kept its name as the only identity. It is thought that the vehicle was sold and moved to a property somewhere in the Two Wells, Virginia region. Victorian Railways. By August 1908, Mildura had been rebuilt with 14 berths removed and replaced with a kitchen and dining area and renamed Kiowa. Sleeper No. 6 followed in 1911 with the same conversions made, and it was named Avon. Externally, the cars were still marked as first-class sleepers with no reference to the kitchens. Latrobe was given to the VR in 1920, but no records exist of any conversion away from the sleeping car configuration. Kiowa and Latrobe were withdrawn in 1929, and Avon in 1932. E-type carriages. 16 E-type sleeping cars were built at Newport workshops, primarily for the Adelaide-Melbourne service. The first 4 cars had been built by 1908 and were originally named Melbourne, Ballarat, Walsall, and Adelaide. In 1910, these cars were renamed Loddon, Leonald, Finnis, and Torrens respectively, after rivers between the two capital cities. In 1911, Onkaparinga and Bar 1 were built, to be followed by Baterloo, Dargo, Pekina, and Tambo in 1919. In 1923, 4 more cars were named Angas, Coliban, Akron and Inman, and a further two cars, Butchin and Wando, were constructed to a modified internal design with the smoking/saloon area replaced with a 10th sleeping compartment. This 10th compartment was slightly longer than the rest. Later, three further sleeping cars were built with a similar internal layout and named Werribee, Indi and Ovens. As far as can be ascertained, only the first 14 cars were built as shared vehicles. The last two, Butchin and Wando, appear. This is reflected in the 1939 decision by the Victorian Railways, with no input from the South Australian Railways, to remove the names of those sleeping carriages and replace with numbers 4 and 5, following on from Werribee, Indi and Ovens as sleepers 1, 2 and 3 respectively. At the same time, Butchin/No. 4 was fitted with an air conditioning unit powered by axle-driven generators. Notably, Butchin, Akron, and Angus were built on the underframes originally used under E-type dining cars Campaspe, Galburn, and Wimmera respectively. With the exception of the last two, the cars were designed with 9 two-berth sleeping compartments, with cupboards and a folding wash basin in each. In day form, each compartment would be able to sit two passengers. At night the seat folded down for the first bed, and the second was lowered from the wall panels above that seat to give a bunk arrangement. A saloon was provided at one end of the car, called the gentleman's lounge and reserved for smoking passengers. This area was identified with its longer external window either side, and was supplied with 4 loose leather chairs, though by the 1950s these were replaced with 2 chairs of a different style. When traffic required it, the lounge area could be converted to a further 2 berths, but due to lack of privacy the section was charged at normal first-class rates instead of the higher first-class sleeper rates applied. At the non-smoking end 2 of the compartments were reserved for ladies, and these were separated from the rest of the car by swing doors fitted in the side corridor identical to the one separating the lounge from the corridor. Each compartment was accessed by sliding doors with colored lead lights in lieu of normal glass, and an attendance room was provided at both ends of each car. One of these had tea-making facilities and a lavatory. Like the rest of the E-cars, the sleepers initially had a strong Edwardian style with features including carved paneling, pressed metal ceilings, frosted glass, and lamp pendants, all being ornately decorated. A row of beveled mirrors was provided above the windows on either side of the cars with an engraved starburst pattern, though these were removed in later years due to corrosion. 3 mirror panels were provided above each compartment window and 7 over the saloon windows. The first service run of the cars was a parliamentary special to Echuca on 17 October 1907, with sleepers Melbourne, Adelaide and Ballarat, and parlour car Murray, leaving Melbourne at 5:30 p.m. From 31 October the cars were regularly scheduled on the Intercolonial Express from Melbourne to Adelaide. Tambo, Angus, Coliban, Akron, and Inman were built from new with electric lighting, and, as noted above, Butchin and Wando featured a 10th compartment instead of a lounge area for 20 berths. The Overland. From 1936, the named joint stock cars were externally painted dark green with the Overland in chrome-plated letters on the fascia panel above the windows to introduce the new brand for the Melbourne to Adelaide Express. From 1943, the green scheme was traded out for the standard Victorian Railways bright passenger red. Split fleet. As steel cars were introduced to the Overland from late 1949, the timber cars were split among the two systems. In 1950, the South Australian Railways purchased Victoria's share in Angus, Dargo, Finnies Ix Walselly, Onkaparinga and Tambo, leaving 9 cars in joint stock service. Angus had been purchased in March and Finnies in April. Both were painted in the green and yellow scheme at time of sale, and fitted with half-drop windows and steel side sheets from the late 1950s. By the 1960s both had been repainted into red with silver stripes, in something of a facsimile of the new Overland scheme. It seems likely that Dargo and Onkaparinga experienced the same changes, given that Onkaparinga had the steel sides in place when it was finally withdrawn. However, Tambo clearly did not have steel sides fitted below the windows in 1985. A further four joint stock cars, Waterloo, Bar 1, Glenelg x Ballarat and Torrens x Adelaide, were condemned in 1967. It is likely that Bar 1 and Glenelg were scrapped http://www.comrails.com/sarcarriages/and Glenelg. Baterloo was sold without bogies and moved to Junction RD Littlehampton, South Australia, owned by Jolene Liebelt, and Torrens was transferred to the then new Australian Railway Historical Society Museum in Newport, Victoria. It is now a static exhibit. South Australian cars. The South Australian cars were allocated to the Mount Gambier overnight service, with Phineas and Angus externally rebuilt in 1953 to provide a better quality of travel. Tambo, Onkaparinga and Dargo were not refurbished, though at some point Onkaparinga was fitted with steel sheeting over the sides in an attempt to preserve the timber. In 1972, the South Australian Railways sold Onkaparinga to the Marbury School in Aldgate with bogies. In 1988, it was donated to the Port Dock Station Railway Museum. In 1974, Dargo was condemned and sold without bogies to a private property in Lameroo, South Australia, and was reported to be in good condition and stored under cover. Tambo followed in 1975. On 24 September 1976, Angus caught fire while on the Mount Gambier run due to a worn brake block generating sparks and heat. There were no injuries and passengers were transferred to an adjacent carriage, but most of the car was damaged, and the repair cost was estimated at the time to be in excess of $30,000. As a result, the car was withdrawn from service at the same time the other cars were withdrawn and placed into storage. Phineas and Angus were passed to the Australian Railway Historical Society's South Australian Division, operating as Steam Ranger. Phineas stayed at Steam Ranger where it operates today, while Angus was sold off to the York Peninsula Railway, due to the high cost of repairing it. Angus was sold off again, due to the same reason. Eventually, it ended up in NSW where it was repaired and turned into B&B accommodation. Tambo was planned to go to the Pitchai-Richai Railway, but after being stored for several years at Peterborough, it was transferred to Steam Ranger in 1980, then awaiting restoration at their Dry Creek depot. Victorian cars. From 1965, the Victorian Railways introduced the Train of Knowledge, essentially a mobile school camp for week-long tours. The train made use of the E-type sleeping cars for students and teachers, as they were increasingly being displaced by newer steel cars. The remaining 5 joint stock sleepers, Akron, Coliban, Inman, Pekina, and Loddon x Melbourne, became part of the Victorian Railways fleet on 27 June 1969. They had names removed and replaced with numbers, as sleeping cars No. 6 through 10 following on from No. 5 x Wando. Between November 1983 and May 1984, these carriages were upgraded. Restoration work included repainting, revarnishing, new upholstery, new carpeting, retention toilets, and reinstatement of the Preminis 1969 names. Current status. As noted above, Bar 1 and Glenelg were most likely scrapped in 1967. Steam Ranger in South Australia initially had Angus, Coliban, Phineas, Inman, and Tambo. Of those, Phineas has always been in operational condition, both before and after the move from Dry Creek to the Victor Harbour line. However, in 1995, Angus was sold for use on the York Peninsula Tourist Railway. When that line closed in 2009, the car was sold to Australian Train Movers and was transferred to Londonderry in NSW. In 2011, the car was delivered to Little Forest Country Cottages in the Southern Highlands, NSW, and by the end of 2012 it was restored as a bed and breakfast. Tambo was sold to West Coast Railway in the mid-1990s and delivered to their Ballarat East Depot in 1996. When West Coast Railway folded in 2004, the car was sold privately and it has since been restored to operational condition, though half converted to a parlour car style, similar to that of Yarra and Murray, and it runs on the Victorian Goldfields Railway. Akron was allocated to the VGR in August 2017 pending restoration. Coliban and Inman were sold in 1997-98 and transferred by road to Steamrail, Victoria, in the West Block of Newport Workshops. There, they joined Werribee and Indi, and most of the cars are now serviceable. Also at Newport, 707 operations has Butchin, currently under restoration, and was joined by Wando in 2017, and the Victorian division of the Australian Railway Historical Society has preserved Torrens in their museum in the southeastern corner of the Newport Workshops compound. It has been externally restored, and as of late 2016, the interior is also being fixed up. In the early 1990s, the majority of the train of knowledge consist was allocated to the Seymour Railway Heritage Centre, including sleeping carriages Wando, Akron, Pekina, and Loddon. The first three were deemed surplus to requirements in 2017, with Akron transferred to the Victorian Goldfields Railway, Pekina to the Overland Museum in Enhill, and Wando to 707 operations. Onkaparinga was restored in 2010 to early 1950s condition at the Port Dock Rail Museum. In 1986, Baterloo was noted as being in poor condition, but in 2003 it was sold to Jim Emmett of the Mount Lofty Railway Station. At the time, the car was intended to be stabilized, then transferred to Lofty Railway Station's gardens for restoration as a static exhibit. The shift was later called off account difficulties in arranging proper transportation, so the vehicle is still in Littlehampton, wrapped in tarps. Cargo is currently undercover on private property. Long W-type carriages. 3 sleeping cars were constructed by the Victorian Railways in 1928 to supplement those used on the Mildura and other overnight services. They used a similar internal arrangement to the last 2 E-type sleepers, Butchin and Wando, but were wider with steel panels used in lieu of timber slats for the sides, and a curved roof matching the long W carriages. 10 single-sided compartments were fitted, each capable of seating 4 second-class sitting passengers or 2 sleeping passengers along one wall. The cars were initially painted in standard VR dark red and rostered for use on the Melbourne to Mildura overnight trains. While the cars were generally similar to the earlier joint stock sleeping cars, they were exclusively built for use on the Victorian Railways system. Like Butchin and Wando, the lounge area was replaced with a 10th sleeping compartment, which was slightly larger than the others. To avoid confusion, in 1939, they were renumbered sleeping cars number 1, 2, and 3 in build order, with Butchin and Wando becoming 4 and 5 respectively in lieu of names. Around the same time, they were fitted with air conditioning systems powered by axle-mounted generators and repainted into blue and gold. Unlike the earlier cars, Werribee, Indi, and Ovens were fitted with second-class bench seats in lieu of first class, so they had capacity for 40 sitting passengers in day form. Current status: Steamrail Victoria maintains Werribee and Indi in the West Block of Newport Workshops. Ovens is with the Seymour Rail Heritage Centre. Pullman Carriages, Southern Aurora Carriages, Roomette Cars Elaine. 20 Elaine cars were built from 1959 to 1971. Cars 2323-2327 were the first built, and they were followed by 2344-2354, 2372, and 2376-2378. The first 5 were constructed for the Brisbane Limited Express from 1959, and the design was mostly repeated with the 11 Southern Aurora cars from 1961. The only difference was the arrangement of access to the bathroom and the location of the doorway for accessing the conductor's compartment. The modified design was also applied to 2372, built as extra capacity for the Brisbane Limited, and 2376-2378 built to replace cars 2345, 2346, and 2350 destroyed in the 1969 Violet Town crash. These cars used a central curved hallway with compartments either side, providing a total of 20 single-person berths. In daylight hours, the beds would be folded away and replaced with a single lounge chair and small table. Twinet cars NAM and FAM. A total of 19 NAM Twinet sleeping cars were constructed across 5 batches, from 1959 to 1971, numbered 2328-2332, 2335-2343, 2367-2368, 2373. The first 5 were constructed for the Brisbane Limited Express from 1959, and the design was repeated with 9 cars built for the Southern Aurora. Each car had a side hallway serving an attendance compartment at pone end plus 10 individual compartments. Each of these could seat 3 passengers in day mode, but were only fitted with 2 berths in a bunk arrangement for night travel. The berths were set up while passengers were in the dining room for dinner, and restored to seating format following breakfast each day. The name Twinet indicates 2 people per sleeping compartment. The 10 FAM cars built for the Brisbane Limited and Gold Coast Motorrail were based on a more modern design, as applied for the Indian Pacific Fleet from 1970. Compartments were a little larger each, and as such the cars only had capacity for 18 passengers in 9 compartments, or 27 sitting. Deluxe Twinet cars DAM. 1 deluxe Twinet sleeping carriage was built for each system. Victoria had DAM 2333 on 2 BU bogies at 42 tons, and New South Wales had DAM 2334 on 2 BS bogies for 43 tons. The cars were almost identical to the NAM sleepers, with compartments attached to a side car door and a small conductor's cabin at one end. The main difference was that the DAM cars' center 2 compartments were merged, with the internal wall removed and the whole space allocated to only 2 sleeping passengers rather than 4. This luxury compartment provided a wider bed at one end, with 2 armchairs and a full WC and shower, and was placed in the center of the carriage for maximum comfort. The cars entered service in February and March 1962, and were both in use until 1991, then stored to August of 1994. The Overland Carriages. When the Overland service was converted from E-type carriages to a new steel, fully air-conditioned train, 8 new sleeping cars were built. The interiors of these new cars were of a more modern design than the older cars. The roomette cars had a zigzag corridor instead of a straight one, and the compartments had the shape of a trapezium. This enabled the use of the toilet and wash basin units while the bed was still down, not possible in the older roomettes. In 1949, the class leader, Alumbi, entered service, followed by Tantini, Waroni, Dorai, Murori, and Chalaki in 1950, and Namaldi and Makai in 1951. Of those, Alumbi, Tantini, Mururi, and Chalaki were roomette cars with zigzag corridors. The other 4 were standard compartment-style Twinet cars. The sleeping cars were of 2 types. Twinet cars had 2 berth compartments, as had the E and MAN cars before them, but each compartment had an adjoining toilet and shower room. Roomette cars had single berth compartments either side of a central aisle, and a shower room at the end of the car. The new cars were not numbered, but instead given names based on Aboriginal words related to sleep or dreams. Additional carriages were built a few years later, with roomettes Nankuri and Prapawi in 1955, Twinets Tolkini later Malkari, and Tandani later Peti in 1956, Twinets Yanni and Kuldalai in 1957, and roomettes Juki and Tarkanji in 1958. 2 further cars were built in 1967, Twinets Tawari and Yankai, for a total fleet of 18. These last two had a slightly different interior layout. In 1971, the SAR share in room at cars Allenby and Tantini and twine at cars Dorai and Woroni was sold to the Victorian Railways for use on the Vinelander to Mildura. They were repainted dark blue and their names removed. These names were then applied to the same type of new cars built to replace them. The new sleepers, Woroni and Dorai 1971 and Allenby and Tantini 1972, were built with the altered interior matching the 1967 batch, though Allenby and Tantini were still roomettes. Under Victorian Railways, the cars had blue painted where maroon had previously been used, with Vinelander nameplates on the carriage sides in place of the names. The cars were numbered as sleepers NOS 11 to 14, previously Allenby, Tantini, Woroni, and Dorai. The New Deal in 1983 saw the four Victorian Railways sleeper carriages renumbered to SJ 281 to 284, and the carriages were repainted again, this time with orange replacing the blue with V/line logos on plates fitted to the left ends. Under Australian National the vehicles were allocated classes, with Mururi Chalaki, Nankuri, Perpawi, Juki and Tarkinji becoming JR-6, Nimaldi Makai, Tilkini, Tandani, Yani and Kuldalai JT-6, and Tawari and Yankai JT-2. The second Allenby and Tantini became JR-2, and the second Woroni and Dorai JTB-3-4. R was for roomette and T for twinette, with a or B respectively indicating first class for the Preminus 1967 fleet, or second class for the Postminus 1967 fleet. Therefore, it is safe to assume that if the four carriages passed to the Victorian Railways had been retained, they would have been classed as further JRA and JTA unit. S-type carriages to provide for the Spirit of Progress's conversion to standard gauge from 1962. Two of the BS class carriages were converted to composite sitting/sleeping cars for the run from Melbourne to Canberra. 6 BS became 1 VAC, and 5 BS became 2 VAC. One car was attached to each train with a spare 1 VAM. From the No. 1 end, compartment 1 was left unaltered, and compartment 2 was converted to first-class accommodation, with 6 seats in place of 8 and additional armrests. The remaining 6 compartments were cleared out, and every second interior wall was removed. Compartment pairs 3 and 4, 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 had their separation walls shifted, so that each compartment could sit 3 or sleep 2 passengers, with wardrobes taking up the remaining space. The 3-seat assembly at the outer wall of each compartment pair could fold down to provide one bed, while the other was permanently in situ. Each car had a capacity of 8 second and 24 first-class passengers in daytime, or 8 second, 6 first, and 12 sleeping passengers at night. Compartments 1 and 2 were refitted to the same pattern as the rest circa 1977, giving a capacity of 24 sitting passengers or a nighttime capacity of 16 passengers. In 1978, the 2 cars were returned to broad gauge and took on the numbers No. 15, Sleeper X1 VAC, and No. 16, Sleeper X2 VAC, following on from Sleepers 1-10XE type carriages and Sleepers 11-14XV and SAR Overland Carriages for operation on the Mildura train. By 1982, they had been internally refitted as full sleeping carriages, rather than composite sitting/sleeping as they had been for standard gauge service. In late 1984 and early 1985, the two were renumbered SS285 and SS286 in line with the New Deal numbering system. When the Vinelander sleeping car service started winding down in the late 80s/early 90s, the cars were converted back to their original BS format as BS218 and BS219. Z-type carriages. The composite sitting/sleeping car, Valmont, was built with 10 evenly spaced windows per side, plus a closer window and a door at the No. 2 end. Access to the car was via the doors at the known Q end, or via coupled carriages, and the diaphragms linking them to VA moan. The 10 windows each represented a single compartment. The first and second compartments at the number 1 end were fitted with bench seats for 4 people each, while the other 8 compartments were fitted with 3-person seats divisible with retractable armrests. All seats could fold down to form a bed, and above that was a second bed, giving capacity for up to 20 sleeping passengers or up to 24 first-class and 8 second-class passengers. Generally speaking, only the first 4 compartments at the number 1 end were used for sitting passengers, and the remaining 6 were used exclusively for sleeping passengers. Partially because of this, the public address system was only wired to the 4 compartments at the number 1 end and not the other 6. Each compartment also had its own cupboard, shower, toilet, card table, and wardrobe. The interior was sheathed with Luminex panels. At the number 2 end, a small curtained-off area was reserved for the carriage conductor, with a seat to work at. Weight of the car was 51 tons 13 cwt. Water capacity was 280 gallons of cold water, plus 75 gallons of hot water for the showers. The car was fitted with marker lights, backup lamp brackets, and tail discs at both ends, allowing it to trail any train. Notably, even though the car would only normally trail trains in New South Wales, the end of train marker was a Victorian Railways disc rather than a New South Wales Railways triangle. References equals